Yes.
Having spent 25 years working on the language, do you think that this book is a fairly complete collection of the stories that were preserved? Or do you have reason to believe there are sources out there that might yield additional stories in the future?
Well, for a long time we were finding new stuff, Daryl and I, about every 2 years. We were finding new data sources. That's not happening as much now. New stuff does not turn up as much. And while I would love to think that maybe there's something in the Smithsonian or in the Indiana State Library that they misfiled, I don't know. We may have all of the I think we probably have all the stories now. There might still be old French manuscripts or dictionaries around, and I still keep hoping that some sort of sound recordings will turn up someday. But I kind of don't. We probably have found all the stories there are. Yeah.
Did you have any sound recordings to work on?
No. Well, there's a few extremely skimpy sound recordings. It basically amounts to maybe a dozen words, about a dozen words embedded as isolated words in recordings of people speaking English. More sound recordings could have been made. There were people that could have been recorded all the way up to the 60s, but no one bothered.
Do you have several versions of a story or two?
Yes. And you'll see if you look through the book, there's multiple versions of certain stories. Like the story of Fox and Wolf was a really common story among both Myaamia and the Peoria. And there were different versions. Sometimes one person would give several versions of it. Several different speakers gave at least one. And sometimes there was like multiple versions, but they're almost the same. And so we had to sort of make a judgment call as to how many we would include. And basically the decision we made was if a version is significantly different, we included it as its own version. But yeah, there's actually multiple versions of several stories. So, yes?
So your next project then would be to have an edited version of these same stories, and how
Yes.
large of a project will that be, and what's the timetable?
Good question. Did Daryl tell you to ask that? Yeah, in addition to this version, I'm also doing what I call an annotated version of these same stories, where what I do is I do a word-for-word translation right there. You know, this is what it looks like now. Oops, hang on here. Okay, where you just have the Myaamia or Peoria on one side and English on the other. I'm also doing a version where instead of doing it that way, I have the original transcription, the phonetic Myaami, a word-for-word translation of what exactly each word really means, and then a free translation like that, and which is basically, but that takes vastly longer to do, because a lot of times I know perfectly well what a sentence means, but I still haven't figured out a certain word that's in it. You know, like a lot of times it's possible to find a certain word that only ever appears once ever in all the stories, you know, and they didn't even bother to say what it meant. So that's a project I'm working on it'll take a lot longer, but, and it's also going to have a glossary too, where each word is in the back and is translated and explained. But that takes a lot longer than a book like this. But I think it's necessary to sort of take everything I figured out about the stories and actually make sure it's, you know, written down someplace. Anything before I put the mic down? Okay.
I have a last question for Dr. Costa. With all of the reference materials that you currently have, how long is it going to take you to finish translating all of them?
Another 50 years, maybe?
He's not kidding.
No.
No.
And there's only one Dr. David Costa. He is the preeminent expert in the Myaamia language. And know this, that his part is so unique because he's so respectful about how he interacts with our community. David Costa, as a linguist, does not come in and say, here's how you're going to say your word, and here's what you will do with it. He is the translator. He's the guy that breaks it all down and figures out what that says. And then it goes to another very important person. Our relative, Daryl Baldwin, has worked with this language. I would have to say if it were not for Daryl Baldwin, we would not have our language program today as it is. Doesn't mean that we wouldn't have sought our language. Doesn't mean that we wouldn't have eventually gone down this path. But he certainly was the individual who started the faucet dripping. I remember the first time I met these guys. Again, I believe it was 1996. And who knew where we would be today? Daryl is, as David is the translator, Daryl is in many ways, the interpreter. The work that he does, researching and understanding and coming to live with and by Myaamia culture is what gives life to the language for all of us. It's what makes it breathe for me. Not that David's work doesn't. David's work kind of zooms right over my head, with great respect. But Daryl, as my brother, has always helped put it into terms that make it something I can live with and something I can actually think that maybe someday I can use more often. And so I asked Daryl if he would speak to you tonight a little bit about these stories, not so much to interpret them for you, but I think that what he's prepared to say to you is maybe more along the terms of life experience, which is what we would expect from him. So welcome your relative.
Hewe nemese. O ai ewe mela ka koke te pewe neola ka koke o aha nugi pekondeki. It's good to see all of my relatives here tonight. 17 years ago, my wife and I got the bright idea that we were going to reintroduce language into our home. Not only did we not know the language at that time, we had no clue what that work would look like and what it would involve. We also had no clue where it would go, what it would become. And for me, it's incredibly humbling. It's probably about the best way I can put it. I remember reading these stories for the first time. That was quite a few years ago. I also remember that they didn't make much sense to me at the time. In my own humble beginnings, the names Papangamwa, Wisakachakwa, Wemba, and Wilaktwa were all foreign to me. I didn't know them, and I didn't understand what they were doing in the stories. But as my own knowledge of language, culture, and history continued to grow and deepen over the years, the stories began to take on meaning for me. They began to emerge in my own mind as very relevant, not only for understanding my ancestors' way of life, but they were becoming relevant to my own life, and I did not expect that. Our ancestors had in their time, and we have here today, our own ways of knowing. And these stories have much of that embedded within them. Unfortunately, many important stories were not recorded, and those knowledge gaps will have to be filled by future generations of knowledgeable people. One cultural hero in particular continues to influence me the more I learn about him, and he's called Wisakachakwa. Wisakachakwa is a central figure in our stories and is well known to many other tribes as well. Wisakachakwa appears as a human figure. In some cases, he has a brother, and he has a mother and father. He carries all the features of a human being. Aside from his formal name, Wisakachakwa, we also know him as Kemeshumena, or our grandfather. That's the proper kinship term to use when referring to Wisakachakwa. But Wisakachakwa is a Manitou because he can do things that no human can do. Wisakachakwa has great powers and can accomplish whatever he sets his mind to do. But he's obsessed with trying to be like others. He spends a great deal of time trying to do what others do, but he often fails. He can be brilliant at times, and the next moment do the most foolish things. There's times when he exhibits kindness, respect, and compassion, and the next moment he can be greedy, disrespectful, even violating the sacred. He can speak eloquently, and the next moment be profane. Because of his powers, Wisakachakwa can also create, and then the next moment he can destroy. He can be liked, but be careful, because just when someone trusts him, he ends up harming them. But most of all, he fills in the gaps of the unknown. He is the unknown, the unexplainable, the unpredictable. That is Wisakachakwa. It's through the antics of Kimeshumina, our grandfather, Wisakachakwa, that we're reminded of ourselves. Just as he can create and destroy, so too can we humans. Wisakachakwa reminds us that if we are to survive, we must remember him and continue to talk about him, learning from him, and creating new stories about him. We need him for us to survive. And that's the reason that I chose the passage at the front of the story publication, which I thought I would end. It was Wisakachakwa who said, "Ekwe kate ashkiwi, penama kisingi, alenia ekwe metosene witche, kate nindaya cheme koke nusamake, nindaya aalhsoohkaana koke." As long as the earth endures, and as long as man is alive, my grandchildren will talk about me and tell stories about me. Wisakachakwa. Newe, I hope you enjoy the story collection, and I certainly hope you enjoy the wonderful storytelling tonight. It's been a long-awaited time, and I'm really looking forward to enjoying it myself. Newe.